All right, boys and girls, here we are. We're back once again for another edition of the Astro Weather. It is May 11th, 5/11. What sort of magic and mystery and synchronicity awaits us on an 11 day? Peachy, are you taking notes? We have the great Peachy in the house tonight. I gotta get a Peachy cam one of these days soon, just so I can do a cutaway. There's a little bit of a turf war going on here. Peachy's feeling her oats. She's feeling her oats and definitely got Jasper at her crosshairs. It's very funny. Very, very funny. Anyway, welcome. And why don't we get into the weather? Let's just jump into it. I'll try not to be as verbose as I was yesterday when it came to talking about, I went back and I listened to the start. I think I probably let the Mark David Chapman segment go on for a little too long. There was a natural cutoff point, and I kept going. And I guess my intent was to kind of hammer home this one point of the chart. Maybe I was a little too overzealous with the hammering. So I'm going to try to be more concise and economical today. That's my goal for the day. And let's see what we have here. All right, this is where we left off. And let's see, I want to zoom in a little bit. Come on, buddy. All right, here we go. Open her up. So now today we have the moon. It's just crossed over Pluto, and Pluto's still in this opposition with Mars, and of course, as Mars continues its regression through the sign, we will have more of an intense opposition, and will be ultimately a fixed opposition. And it was really interesting last night. We had the whole Trump town hall CNN event. There were some interesting things going on with media. Like Trump kind of took over CNN and demolished it. It was very interesting. That's so Aquarius is how we ultimately exchange our information now. We're really in the Aquarian. We're in the Aquarian age, and it always boggles my mind that there are people who argue against this, and their reasoning or the rationale that we're not in the Aquarian age is because it's not all cool. And that cracks me up, right? Just look around you. Does this look like the Aquarian age? I said, yeah, it kind of does. It's just not, and we're just getting started. And the high strange is going to get really, really wild. So Aquarius is how we communicate. And then really over the last 24 hours, you had the news of Tucker Carlson partnering with Elon Musk, which, by the way, we've been talking about for weeks here. And then Trump blasting through CNN and plundering and pillaging the so-called left, and some of that was concurrent with this position of the moon, especially last night with Trump on CNN. It's an odd moon today, right? Because the Aquarian moon is all about being, well, a little quirky and detached, and there's a friendly element to the Aquarian moon, but there's also it's eccentric. That's how I would use the term for the Aquarian moon. It's eccentric in one of its more softer colloquialisms in a lot of ways. But here we have this strange, especially early in the day, conjunction with the moon and Pluto. Pluto, of course, is uber intense and really much more connected with ideas around obsession. And even last night, you can see that last night where people were going nuts on social media. The Trump derangement syndrome was at 11 if you were using the spinal tap scale. And it's going to be very interesting, I guess, just from a general populist perspective, to see from, I don't think it's dispassionate though. Like, even though the moon here early in the day theoretically is slightly dispassionate, but friendly, unusual, curious, slightly scientific, Pluto gives it a weird tweak. One of the things that I would say with this moon and Pluto early in the day would be to kind of keep an eye. I mean, you can do it with the Aquarian moon. Keep an eye on what you obsess about. Like, there are just things that are out of our control in a lot of ways, and you get this very intense kind of hot cold with Moon Pluto. Pluto can be hot, right? I mean, it has that intensity about it. It has that very distant yet potent cosmic heat. It turns up the volume on things. So it's a hot, cold kind of start to the day. Like, there's this intensity, and yet there's this sense of being able to maybe step back a little bit. There's going to be a lot of examination today, just in terms of what happened last night. And I think this is a very interesting day in a lot of ways, just because of this Moon Pluto conjunction. And of course, we're moving into the squares over the next 48 hours, where we have all this investment in Taurus. And keep an eye on the markets. The markets, I think, we're coming into a Friday. They always like to dump the bad news on a Friday, so they can keep it out of the news cycle. And so when we see the moon coming in here in Aquarius and starting to square against all these planets that are really connected to your resources, right? Just keep an eye on. I will also keep a real close eye on the crypto market as well. Keep a very close eye on the crypto market, and maybe we will see some. I don't know. Everybody who is a big XRP person keeps waiting for this SEC ruling, and I'm not going to go on the record and say it's going to happen, but there definitely is a bit of a I wouldn't say buzz. The energy seems to be very kind of electric, and there's a lot of static electricity around crypto, CBDCs, right? And I think this gets into, from a personal perspective, what are you going to do with your money? This is all about the money, and it's getting so hard to live because people are really strapped financially, economically. So I think in this regard, there's the upside of the moon in Aquarius today is that you can kind of step back and not be so drawn in and sucked in by fear in a lot of ways. That's the upside. The downside is you may not pay close enough attention. It may be so detached that you may not say, oh, well, who gives a shit? We'll all be in the same boat anyway. Right. Which is probably the ultimate stoic outcome that one person might have when faced with the potential for national financial calamity. So this is the hot and the cool. The cool is, okay, all right, there's nothing we can do about it. Let's observe it while it happens. Let's watch the car wreck in slow motion while it happens, the train wreck in slow motion while it happens. But on the other side, there's you should be paying attention. I think the placement of the moon offers some space, some critical space, in order to not have to deal with, really kind of what's in my mind, especially as Mercury keeps going backwards and retrograding, this idea of financial security and safety. So it's a very interesting moon, and even in conjunct with Venus. And when we think of Venus, we do think about things that we have relationships with, and a lot of times there are possessions, and especially in Cancer. And a lot of people, think about the Earth signs as being very related to material goods and possessions, which is true. But sometimes the water signs can be very, water is looking for ground. And so it would not be uncommon, for there to be an unusual, not unusual, but a congruent relationship with material things or the things of the earth. We have water transits or water signs. It's the container, like the earth is the container for the water to exist in. So the two are very symbiotic. And in Cancer, a sign that really likes to collect things. When I think of hoarding, I think of Cancer. When I think of hoarding, sometimes I think of Scorpio. But with Scorpio, people can go through massive kinds of internal combustion moments and then get rid of things. But that's not always the case with Cancer. So today, especially, well, actually over the last week since Venus has moved into Cancer, and I like Venus in Cancer, by the way. I think it's a great placement for Venus, and has a lot of empathy and just natural care for our families, our homes, our lives, our pets, our children. It's a great placement for Venus transit. And yet at the same time, because of the nature of Venus, we're looking at our relationship to the things that we hold on to. And Cancer loves to hold on to things. So the inconjunct today with the moon gets us to kind of look at that again, from a dispassionate perspective. I mean, from the position of the chart, at least early on in the day, with the moon being the highest planet in the chart, we can really look down on some of these things and not be all that attached to them. And I would say, yesterday was interesting. I was talking about paying off your debts, and I was talking about adjustable rate mortgages. You probably want to handle those if you can. And then somebody in chat, I forget who it was. Was it Lana? I forget who it was, but they were saying that that's exactly what they were going to do, right? Like it's in the air. And I could see today where people are thinking about like defaulting, or people are thinking about what happens if they declare bankruptcy, or what happens if they don't pay their debts off. And I'm not the best person. Not that I welch on my debts. I trust me, I pay my bills. But sometimes there are things that you can and do need to let go of. Like there was a time where I was hospitalized back in 2016, and I was in the hospital for 3 days, and I didn't have any medical coverage. And I'm just, keeping it straight, keeping it real. Like I didn't have any real, ability to, pay that off at that time. So I dealt with it, right? Dealt with the hit on my credit report. And I think there are people that are in this position, and there's pros and cons to it, obviously, but I haven't invested in the credit system. I don't even own a credit card. So there's pros and cons to stepping away from the things that you really can't handle. There's pros to being able to on some of those areas and some of those fronts handle those things. And this is one of those days where it feels like, okay, well, what happens if I do walk away from some of these things? What happens if I do? And they used to make it a lot easier for people to declare bankruptcy, and then that got much more difficult, especially for the common person. But this is where the energy is today, and it kind of leaks into relationships again as well with the inconjunct. And there's a more dispassionate view of even relationships. in some ways. It's an I would say it's kind of an odd day, but it's also an interesting day. Anytime you bring Aquarius into the fold, it's interesting. Venus is trining Saturn. So I would surmise with the Venus Saturn trine and Venus getting closer that those commitments are important, at least identifying the ones that are important and then sticking with them. We kind of got into this yesterday with this fork in the road with Venus and Neptune. You can see it, and you know, trying to establish where your boundaries are, staying open and permeable, but at the same time, making sure that you can, again, you know, honor your commitments. And debt is a commitment to a large extent, unless it's onerous. You know, unless it's onerous. If it's onerous, then you may want to re-examine it. And today is one of those days where people are looking at it like, well, what would happen if I, you know, declared bankruptcy, or what would happen if I walked away from this? I mean, you can always negotiate. That's what they always say. You can always negotiate. And today might be a pretty good day for that, even with the Venus-Jupiter sextile, which I think would be good for negotiation. Like, let's find a win-win in some ways. I think really that's kind of the big energy for me when I see this. Is this, you know, is the moon in Aquarius is crossed over Pluto and has a very unique effect on the rest of the chart. I think the downside of this is paralysis, especially when it comes to finances. Because while the Aquarian moon can be very, very good at being objective and not taking things all that personally, there is this energy in the air where you do have to look at it, or like you have to engage in it. You have to engage in your emotional relationship to your finances and your resources. And especially with this Mercury retrograde, that's really the biggie. And it doesn't, I don't think it goes direct until what, the 15th. So we've got a few more degrees of Mercury retrograde that we're dealing with, and it's moved back into the first decan, right? So it's in the Taurus decan, and we're really we're counting our pennies. Where did our money go? You know, where you know, where banks, man, I'm telling you, keep an eye on the banks. Like, where's your money going? Where is your money going? And I don't think Mercury retrograde is bad here. I think it'd actually be really, really good. If you have the wherewithal to just roll up your sleeves and today, again, look dispassionately at your finances and your resources, I think you'll find out some interesting things around money and debt and commitment. The only downside with the moon and Aquarius here with Mercury is, again, sort of the, I wouldn't say instinct is high, is a high priority with the moon and Aquarius. But if there's an instinct evolve, it's a very mental instinct. It's an instinct that's derived from having a very broad view of what's happening socially in a lot of ways, right? I mean, that, and when you get into that space where the mind and and your instinctual body are firing together, that's kind of where it happens. It would happen in Aquarius, and I think in some ways in Gemini as well, moon in Gemini as well. But the downside, again, because of the fixed sign, is that there could be a more rational, or what I would call highly evolved instinctual response to things, and you could be frozen with this Mercury moon square. You could just be frozen, wanting to hold on to things and not sure if this is the right course of action. Do I do this? It's Mercury retrograde. Is it the right course of action? Here's what I'll say about that, and then we'll move on. If you have to do something financially where you're going to make some sort of decommitment with a debt, we're still in that area, and you are in a relationship, you absolutely must have that conversation with the person that you're with. Do not play rogue today, right? Like this is not the day to all of a sudden, take out your machete to your debt and do things that you think are going to be good for your relationship with your family, then report back later. Do not do that. Do not do that. The same goes with expenditures today. I think if you put two heads together and you're more or less on the same page, I think you can achieve some really, really good results, right? And then it gets you out of the frozen spot over here. Let's see. We have the sun is starting to separate from Uranus, but it's so interesting, right? Like I think it's around Tucker Carlson's birthday, if I'm not mistaken. It's getting really close. He's close to his solar return, and you can just see, again, from the collective perspective, how Uranus is playing a role in a very Taurian personality, and ultimately, again, I think it's going to change the media game. Elon Musk has the moon in Aquarius, so keep an eye on Musk today. I think he'll have some very interesting, perhaps, announcements around economic models and where Twitter is going. He's already talked about it a little bit, but keep an eye on that. And then what else do we have? The Mars-Jupiter square. It's an interesting square. I mean, Jupiter squares open things up. We've talked about this before. It's a Jupiter squares usually are gambling squares in some ways. It's like what if, right? And Mars and Cancer is pretty conservative. It's a pretty conservative. Cancer is conservative. Mars and Cancer can fluctuate a little bit from being conservative to having some kind of reactionary experience towards being too conservative. So the Jupiter square can open that up in some ways, right? And we talked about this before. I think, again, if you're looking at some kind of risk reward factor decision moment right now, I mean, you may want to wait a little bit. I always like to wait with Mercury retrograde. Like here's an example. For instance, let's say you really, really want something. You really, really want something, and you can wait a little bit longer. The waiting pays off. Just wait a little bit longer, because there's that kind of immediacy in wanting to fill the void with the Jupiter-Mars square. And I think waiting under Mercury retrograde is, I think it's an ally. This is. I wouldn't say that this is a day that's fraught with impatience. If anything, the energy is more, I wouldn't say stuck, but when you get up onto that square action up here with just Moon Pluto, there's an objectivity and a detachment that might actually keep you from acting. And then the acting part might be second guessed by your ability to not attach to something, or be in this place where you're re-examining kind of what your values are in a lot of ways. When I think of the moon, I think of values. So this is an interesting day, and again, I think if you can wait a little bit, waiting is your ally. If you're planning on making a purchase, whether or not you justify it, well, we really need this, or it's something that is more of a luxury and you'd like it, just wait a little bit. And I guarantee you the cost of the thing that you're looking at, there's a very good chance it'll come down. If it's not there, this is just my own fail-safe. If it's not there, it wasn't meant for you. That's another part, especially with Mars and Cancer. And And I think it's always really good to be able to walk away from something if you need to. And I think that's kind of part of the energy today, whether it's debt, um, whether it's an owner's contract. There's certainly that energy in there. So just hold off, wait a little bit. You might even get a much better price on the thing that you're eyeballing. And don't be pushed by other people's pressure or sense of expectations, right? That's the one upside with the moon in Aquarius, is that it's kind of cool. That's like, hold on a second, just wait. All right. Did anybody do any art yesterday? Did you guys do any creating? I kind of did. And it was good. It was good. All right, here's our star of the day. What an unusual character. Oh, by the way, I want to give a shout out. Who was it yesterday? I apologize. I'm not in the comment section, but somebody reminded me in the comments yesterday of the show that the person who had a hard time with John Lennon was Donald Fagen of Steely Dan, and actually wrote a song about it. So Mark David Chapman and Donald Fagen were oddly connected. You know, the more I thought about the Mark David Chapman chart, it kind of stuck with me throughout the day. You know, you have this thing that kind of goes on inside of your brain, and then the subconscious works with it. And as I went back into his chart, well, in my mind, I thought to myself, you know, maybe there's another piece here with Mark David Chapman. And the other piece, see, there was something strange about the whole assassination event, right? Because he meets Lennon early in the morning. He meets him earlier in that day. It's outside the Chelsea, and Lennon autographs his record. Now, my question is, why didn't Mark David Chapman just shoot Lennon then? And then he comes back later in the day, and apparently, and this is how Lennon is killed. He was shot in the back. And it just kind of, it stuck with me. Like, why did that happen? And then I kind of went back into his 8th house with all that Gemini. And I thought to myself, one of two things occurred between the time that Lennon gave him that autograph and the time that he shot John Lennon, is that there's a chance in there that he was triggered. I mean, literally a trigger, a figurative trigger, to pull the trigger with Lennon, and that's why he came back. Like somebody or something handled him, right? Like he had this weird connection with this group, World Vision. And some people think World Vision's like a CIA front, right? But the other thing that popped into my head, and again, this is just kind of hunchy, and as it stayed with me throughout the day, that maybe the guy that pulled the trigger on Lennon wasn't Mark David Chapman. And I'm just throwing that out there because it almost felt like that it was establishing his presence, being there with the signing of the record. Right? It was establishing that he was the guy, right? And again, I'm not saying that that's the case, but when you get into the 8th house, it gets really murky and deep, and he has all this Gemini stuff going on in the splitting and the bicameralization of the mind. Anyway, it was just a thought, and I want to actually go back and review it some more, because you know, this is like the intuitive part of astrology where it's just sticking with me. And so normally what I would do now, and which I probably would do, is I will look into the possibility that Mark David Chapman didn't shoot John Lennon. And I'll go through threads, and I'll try to figure out, you know, really what happened between the time that he signed that album and the time that he came back, and why did he do that? And does it relate to Gemini? How does it relate to Gemini? How does it relate to the eighth house? All the other stuff I think is valid and true. When I talked about the true node and I talked about Palace and all the kind of, moral outrage that Mark David Chapman had. But then there's that other part that it just stayed with me throughout the day. And I thought, okay, we got to re-examine this. All right. Sorry, I'm going a little bit long today. Here we go. Salvador Dali is your star of the day. And what an odd man he was. Very strange guy. Look at his chart. He's got, the only thing he has below the horizon is Uranus. And he has Uranus in Sagittarius. He often known as the godfather of Surrealism. Dali was a strange guy. I mean, let's dive into it. His mother was the most important person in his life. He worshipped his mother. You can see the moon at the highest part of the chart, right there. Bada bing, right there. So there's his moon, and it's in Aries, and his mother dies when he's 16 years old, and really in a lot of ways changes his life. And he has this moon south node conjunction, and to me, this is in my mind the seed of surrealism. When you get into Pisces is very artistic, and you get into the liquid arts with Pisces and painting, and so he has something here, right? He has something here that he has to attend to. The other thing that's interesting about Dali is his relationship with Catholicism. Dali was such a strange character. Like he got into this whole thing called like nuclear Catholicism. It's really odd. He got really tied into all these symbols of like the DNA, and he was completely and utterly fascinated with the splitting of the atom, but also as it related to like Christianity. And he was just really a very odd character. And you can even see that with this moon Uranus square. His relationship with women was kind of tortured. He had his lifelong companion, Gala, who was 10 years his senior, and she's a Virgo, right? So her sun is down here in his third house, and she comes off more like in some ways an older sibling for Dali, and they have a very unusual relationship in that at certain points in time, he knew that she would have affairs with other men. And Dali was strange with sexuality. He has a strange relationship with sexuality. He's got that moon Neptune square. He's got moon Uranus. Right? And so his feelings, especially in the very passionate sign of Aries, are kind of fucked up. And one of the things that really marked him as a youth in Spain is that he had seen a series of pictures of genital warts, and he was terrified of female genitalia from that point forward. And apparently the only woman that he ever had quote unquote successful coitus with was Gala. And the truth be known, that Dali was much more interested in how do I say this? I almost avoided it the other day. He was much more interested in anal penetration because of this traumatizing kind of event with seeing these venereal lesions. I don't know how he got a hold of the content, but it marked him for the rest of his life. But he did manage to have a very devoted relationship with Gala, although they were a lot more like brother and sister in some ways. And the other thing it's interesting about Dali is he was actually kind of cruel. You can see that with the moon Uranus square. He was kind of cruel. He was definitely cruel to his sister. He used to throw his sister down the stairs. She wrote a biography, a not so flattering biography about him. Here we are in Gemini over here. And there's Pluto, Neptune. And, people with Pluto in the 12th house, I've talked about this, are just driven. They're driven people. There's something about Pluto there that compels them to, either be famous or achieve some kind of outer reflection of a deeper intensity to be recognized and seen. That's my take on it. That's just my own personal take on it. The other thing with Dali is that he, in a time where everybody was socialist in Europe, especially the Surrealists, he was not. Dali was a Spanish nationalist, and he supported Franco. And that put a big rift between him and Picasso. But Dali doesn't change, right? He doesn't give a fuck. He's got all these planets in Taurus, Sun, Mercury, Mars. Even in the Surrealist community, he doesn't care. And square Saturn over here, and this is his father, and he has this very intense relationship with his father throughout his life, and his father basically disinherited him for a while because of his relationship with Gala, who was still married at the time. He didn't approve of his father was a very staunch Catholic. So you can see the father here in the eighth house, and the whole row and brouhaha around legacies and wills, and eventually Dali had to sue his father's estate to get pieces of art back after he died because he'd been cut out of the will. Like, he wanted those pieces of art back, and so here the father is a big issue in the chart. Right? Saturn limits, so Saturn is limiting this idea of free and unfettered freedom of expression in Aquarius. The other thing that Dali really plays a lot with is time in his paintings, right? Like watches are melting, and there's this kind of liquid spirit that embodies. It's all dripping and oozing. And I think in a lot of ways you can get into the time stuff with Saturn. Right. And Dali lived to be quite old, actually. I think he was a handful in his old age, but nonetheless, he lived, I think, to be 80, 84. He died. He lived a lot longer than I thought he did. And I think in some ways you can attribute that to the Mars-Saturn square. I think people with Mars-Saturn squares also tend to hold on to life. And, they kind of dig their heels, and especially Mars and Taurus. He has Mercury retrograde. It's not as if I think Dali retreated from his positions. I don't think he ever retreated from his positions. He was a guy that didn't apologize to anybody. Hence, Aries on his midheaven, and Jupiter in Aries. There's also like a flirtation with Hitler with Dali. I mean, it's a mustache. Maybe it's a mustache. But he was just contrarian in a lot of ways. And so the question is that a byproduct of the placement of the sun in the 11th house, which is ruled by Aquarius? Is that where the contrarian nature comes into play? Possibly. But he was always unapologetic, as any Aries would be. Right? He's not an Aries, but that's his midheaven. And he was very into the strongman Franco. And so he's got a very, very unusual chart, extremely unusual and unapologetic, and hung out with a lot of different people in that 11th house, but also was rejected at various points in time. Like, all the Surrealists were socialists, and Dali was not a socialist. And that kind of contrarian spirit in his chart is very powerful. And in his art and his work and in his life. And again, I think it has to do with the Uranus square. And even Uranus in Sagittarius at that anaretic degree, like, he's holding on to this very experimental and following through with, again, some degree of the truth. And this is not a chart that is filled with emotion, by the way. I mean, there's water here, but I wouldn't call it an emotional chart at all. He's got Neptune in Cancer, which is fine, but it's in the 12th house. He's got Pallas in Scorpio, water. He's got the South Node in Pisces, water. But this is not a sentimental chart at all. He's got Cancer rising. And that Cancer rising, I think, has a lot to do with his fealty to his family in a lot of ways, and his mother with Cancer on the ascendant. He's a very strange guy, kind of cutting edge in his own way. I think is there a Dali tarot deck too, if I'm not mistaken? Dali was very, very into the paranormal. A lot of the surrealists were very into the paranormal. They all read Freud. They were all interested in kind of getting in touch with the subconscious and letting the subconscious have more reign over the rational mind. And you can see this even in Dali's chart, and I think it comes out of that 12th house with Neptune and Pluto. And he's into money, right? You can just tell he's into money. He's got that Jupiter-Pluto sextile. And there's even kind of a bit of a controversy towards the end of his life where he would take blank canvases or blank lithographs and then sign them, and like they were originals, and then they would lithograph over the top of them and then sell them for significant amounts of money. So there's a very weird kind of value to some of his later lithographs and art, that they're not all originals, right? And you can see this whole thing with Pluto going on with Jupiter and Aries. Like, he doesn't give a fuck. He needs the money, right? He needs the money. I'll tell you one more Dali story, and then we get out of here because I got to go. I'm running way late. He was just the weirdest. He was the weirdest guy when he was growing up. I think he was a real shit. He was just a real shit growing up. And I read this in his a biography by this guy named what's his name, Maddox. Oh, I think his name is August Maddox. And so you'll notice in Dali's paintings that he has crutches. Like, he uses crutches a lot. And there's a reason why he uses crutches. He was very into, like, watching things vegetate and rot. It's like, and again, you can kind of get that with all the Taurus and the organic nature and organic matter, and squaring Saturn in the eighth house, where you're dealing with these ideas of death, and in some ways in Aquarius, inorganic matter. So he has a lot of that stuff in his art, but you'll find crutches in his art. And the reason why we'll find crutches in his art is because when he was a kid, there was a woman who worked at the villa that Dali's parents owned, he grew up in. And I guess at a certain point in time, the customs and the traditions of the work were far more liberal in Spain than they are today. And apparently the help on these very hot Spanish days would walk around without their tops on. And Dali noticed that this woman who was part of the family help had extremely large breasts as she would walk around and do her stuff. This is the story that I read, right? So he had figured out this thing where he found these crutches. And back in the old days, crutches were not really fancy. They were like these sort of hooks and then a piece of wood coming out, and you'd stick the hook underneath your armpit, right? So he had figured out how to use these crutches that were there. And he took, I swear to God, this is true. He took watermelons and he put them in the crook of the crutches. And he placed himself in a position in the barn so that when he called, I guess we'll call her a maid. When he called the maid and she could hear his call, she couldn't see him, but she'd have to bend over to find him because he was hidden. And the whole idea for Dali was for him to get her to expose her breasts over this wall while he was fondling these watermelons. And then obviously he was masturbating. And masturbation is a big theme in Dali's art. He actually has a famous work about masturbation. Anyway, I may be getting a little too graphic and going a little too long, but then what happens is that she's startled because he gets too excited and the crutches with the watermelons collapse, and then she sees him wanking off while caressing these water. The whole thing is fucking surreal, right? It's the roots of surrealism. And so those crutches, you'll see them show up in his art, and there's a reason why, because they played a significant role in his very fertile and erotic imagination from a youth. Anyway, we've gone too long today. I'm sorry. I should say I'm sorry. I don't apologize for it, but join me, please, over on 15 Minutes of Flame. And we're going to get into some of the Tucker stuff, but more of the Trump stuff as well. Trump was on a fucking rampage. He was Colonel Barnes last night over on CNN. We'll talk about it. We'll talk about related items as well. 15 Minutes of Flame. Come on over. We've got a great chat. And I'm behind schedule right now. Don't forget about True Hemp Science. And please go to truehempscience.com and vote for our guy, Chris, and help him become Austin's #1 purveyor of CBD. And that's truehempscience.com. That's easy. The link is right there on the page. And while you're there, stop by and get yourself some really good CBD and use the code 15MINS, 15MINS, and you will get free goodies and product. Always a 30-day money-back guarantee. $150 more, give you free shipping. Come on, join us over on 15. Take care. Use your head in order to discern what's real, your heart to say what's possible. I'm Robert Phoenix. Have yourself